Welcome to Slash Forward. In this episode, we're going to keep things simple and perhaps intimate as we look at a little indie film that has only 6 actors and 1 primary location. It's a straightforward film about a couple who kidnaps another couple and gets themselves stranded in a service station while attempting to avoid a predatory mold that absorbs our nutrients and takes over and reforms biological material. Of course, you must realize I'm describing the 2008 creature feature, Splinter. How could you survive an attack from a semi-sentient fungus that can take you over slowly from a single prick, or through directly attacking you as an amalgamation of various parts and pieces that used to be your friends? We're about to go on a journey with a quartet of fine people who are forced to struggle with just that question. Let me know if you've seen this one and what you thought in the comments below. And if you like any part of this video, hitting the like button would help me out a lot. Let's get to it. We open at a Sherman service station somewhere out in BFE. The clerk's having a lazy afternoon and settles into his lawn chair for some relaxing, which is hard to do with your back to the wilderness. A noise attracts his attention, but he is no fool. He approaches cautiously, but gets his lower extremities shredded nonetheless. As he suffers, we get little bits of a driving scene where we can almost make out what's happening before the sports suit enters the perimeter of one of those old experimental extraction sites owned by the oil companies. While I'm sure this was marked on the map, they still pull about 20 feet off a nearby service road to post up for what basically equates to camping in their backyard. After giving Seth wood, he and Polly almost immediately get to rolling around in the wild grasses. Meanwhile, Dennis and his girl Lacey find their engine destroyed while on their way to Mexico. Determined to salvage the weekend, Dennis insists that they get out and walk it. At the campsite, the tent almost makes Seth give in and head to the nearest motel. But it is their anniversary, and Polly desires to make love in the moonlight. So they soldier on, but end up destroying their only tent, which now severely limits their options. Not a man to travel heavy, Dee chucks their belongings into the woods so they can move swiftly. Lacey's upset with this turn of events, but Dee wins her over with some classic little pet names. And always the gentleman, he even makes sure she's nice and warm, even though his shirt is fully saturated. On their way back to civilization, Seth hits his lady with some anniversary fun facts about nature.
That's a 300-year-old tree at least.
But do you know if they're known for harboring an ancient evil? As they head down the old dusty trail and make jokes about the gnarly and sticky motel room that is likely in store for them, they run past Lacey and decide to stop. Unfortunately, she was honeypotting the young couple, and as a result of their indecision, Dee is able to sneak up on them and take control of the vehicle. While they initially needed a ride, Dee also reveals the amended plan is to hold them until the banks open in the morning, so they can get some spending cash before heading to their destination. As they settle into the situation, Lacey is stricken by a bout of unseasonable shivers. As Dee tosses the phones and searches their wallets, we find out that Seth is a PhD student. When Lacey perks up and inquires if he has yet been entrusted with writing scripts, her affliction comes into focus. Unfortunately for, well, everybody really, Seth is just a biologist. They travel into the night but have to stop after hitting something in the road. Then they file out to change the flat while the truck takes a relaxing piss all over the asphalt. Lacey thought the animal looked like her dead pet Ginger. Despite the low likelihood of this scenario, she goes back to check it out. Distraught, she attempts to compel Seth to use his biology PhD to help her, despite the fact that Ginger is now just a wet spot on the road. Back at the truck, Dee gets a wicked splinter in his finger, but he's a hard man, so he just pulls it out and keeps rolling. With limited options available to him, Seth resorts to wishing Ginger alive, and sure enough, her remains become agitated. When they get snapped at, Lacey fires on the cat flap and runs. In the confusion, they all pile into the car and drive at Lacey's insistence. When they reach a safe distance, she explains what happened, but Dee reassures her that Ginger is dead and suggests that this may be a byproduct of her coming down off the Red Dragon, if you know what I'm saying. As he continues to reassure her, the engine temperature rises, risking a warped head. So they pull off at a nearby service station that's familiar to us. Lacey heads to the bathroom and Dee has Seth fuel up, after reminding him who the big man is. Then he and Polly go inside to get some coolant. They find it to be strangely quiet as everyone goes about their business. Dee attempts to check out but can't raise the clerk, but Lacey finds him in the bathroom, begging for death. She runs up front to warn everyone of the danger, and luckily,
there's a man with spikes.
She's an expert communicator. She's vindicated, however, when a man with spikes comes around the corner and menaces them in short, wonky movements. Despite her early adoption of the danger aesthetic, Lacey gets spiked up, while Seth and the others lock themselves inside. Dee takes a moment to mourn for his lost love, but also reminds them that they're still kidnapped. Things settle down after a few minutes, so Dee snaps back into action, stocking up on phone cords, cigarettes, and cash. When he goes to erase some evidence, he notices Lacey moving outside. But with only 15 pixels demonstrating this, he feels the need to venture out and confirm it. As he prepares to do so, he makes Seth and Polly pinky promise that they won't leverage this to their advantage. He proceeds with extreme caution, staying low just in case there's a sniper nearby. The spines tingle upon the approach of fresh meat, and he drags her back to the station, face down of course. When things start happening, Polly locks the door. Cowardly Seth, however, doesn't want to stir the pot, and the end result has them locked back in the store with a new friend in the form of Lacey's disembodied hand. Seth is interested in its biology, but Dee treats it like a giant spider. But Seth's boundless curiosity gets the best of him and he studies it further, watching as it absorbs nutrients from nearby fluids like some sort of mold or fungus. The hand eventually stops, but the rest of Lacey's body is famished, and it's thirsty for their fluids. They attempt to escape out the back door, but don't have a key. Seth goes back up front to search for one, but is coming up empty when Dee suggests they pop the hinges. So Seth comes back with a screwdriver and they begin to remove the door, as Dee recounts all of his now irrelevant hopes and dreams. Unfortunately, a second layer of security confounds their efforts. Curiously, the banging stops, and they hear the creature shuffling around on the roof. It's then discovered that this was caused by the arrival of the local sheriff. They try really hard to convince her to call for backup, but to also be careful and do so from the safety of her vehicle. Despite her reluctance, they do eventually reach a compromise.
I'm calling it in. Yeah. But I'm not going anywhere.
Well, that's something, I guess. As she raises HQ on her radio, she gets some splinters dropped on her grill before being descended upon and ripped in half. At this point, even grizzled Dennis chucks his lunch in the corner. Afterward, they all take a moment to fall into an infinitely deep pit of despair. Meanwhile, topside, the creature reconstitutes the officer's torso to configure itself into version 2.0. During the next lull, we're reminded of Dee's dirty little secret as Polly and Seth argue over whether they should make for the cruiser or trust that help is now on the way. Then, a third option. They can create a trail of flammable liquid from the back door to the forest, light it on fire and wait for the firemen to come rescue them with their barrel chests and burly arms. Seth is not on board, but in the absence of viable options, they tell him to take a breather while they get to work. But then they hear the crackle of Sheriff Frankel's radio and see that it's just outside the exterior pay station. Seth immediately fashions a device to try to hook it in. Dee attempts to help him add to it, reminding us of the creeping dread consuming his hand. Seth fiddles a bit, but eventually snags the cord and slowly drags it in just over the edge. But the creature drops in to dispute ownership, since it is comprised of the sheriff's torso. It attempts to get in, but can do little more than bleed all over the floor with its weak, squishy human parts. However, this does present as an enticing snack for several pieces now inside the building. After they repel it, Seth and Polly realize suddenly that there's a conspicuous absence of Dee, but they're distracted from this by another autonomous hand, which they do manage to hold off, because really it shouldn't be that strong to begin with. Dee then pops out from behind the OJ to warn them to avoid splinters and invite them into his sweet cooler clubhouse. Once inside, the hand just sort of forgets about them. As they reconvene, the moment is punctuated by his affliction completely ravaging his arm. Now he decides it's an appropriate time to try to stop the spread. He calls for a knife, but then passes out. But it's all good because Seth finally steps up to do him a solid.
It's okay, we're cutting your arm off.
Fair play. But with only a box cutter, surely the bone will pose a— oh, well, okay then. When he wakes up, he's forced to give Seth his props for lopping off his traitorous appendage. Now, feeling high after the adrenal dump, he opens up a bit to share some of his motivations. He wasn't actually going to Mexico. He was trying to get back to his nest egg to gift it to the widow of the man he killed in a robbery that went sideways. Saddled with medical bills, she eventually went bankrupt, and he had been trying to help support her while he did his stretch in the penitentiary. The introspective mood leads Seth to a hypothesis that temperature may be a factor in this situation. He needs to check something first, though, so they all creep out of the safety of the cooler to corner themselves behind the counter. Upon review of the security tape, Seth posits that this simple organism just wanders around, following the warmest object nearby, hoping that it's food. It didn't come for him at first because he was protected by the heat of the engine. If they can stay below the ambient temperature, they would be invisible to the creature. But since the hypothesis means nothing without proper experimentation to back it up, he goes into a zen-like state and attempts to induce hypothermia. Since the outside temp is 92 degrees, he waits until he drops sufficiently below that to give him some time to get to the car. The others toss some hot-ass fireworks out the back door for a distraction, and once the creature shows up, Seth staggers out the front, hoping he can get there without warming up too much. But ya boy is struggling. Bad news when they set off a fresh one, and the Splinter monster seems disinterested. Because when Seth gets to the car, there are no keys, the radio is off, and he can't help but to be hot, attracting the monster's attention. Dee tries to regain control by throwing a firework into the front lot, but the creature is not attracted to the hottest thing around anymore, and it bursts into the store with them. Despite it being a fair 2v2, they duck back into the cooler. Seth tries to unlock a shotgun, nearly blowing his face off, and then we're reminded that there was a puddle of lighter fluid out back. As the building goes up in flames, Seth tries to distract it, and they recognize that they have to get it into the fire. Seeking redemption, Dennis gets up close and personal, firing some shots and taking some splinters before blasting the diesel into a cleansing fireball. Seth and Polly then return to check on him. Recognizing that he's done for, he turns over the widow's address and instructions for accessing his cache of cash. Then they walk off as he ensures there's nothing left behind. As Seth and Polly wander toward the horizon, comforted and leaving the danger behind them, we see that the danger is simply awaiting a new host, upon whom it can feed. Much like in the movie itself, Splinter, the movie itself, started small and seems to have built up a loyal following over time. It has a very sharp and effective narrative, wrapped up in a sort of a little beady movie at just over 80 minutes long. But they spent the money in the right places, utilizing mostly practical effects and using them sparingly but with intensity, taking an excellent creature design and incorporating it into a simple setup that focuses on tension and character development is a winning combination. This is essentially the same recipe that was later used for Attack the Block, another good example that puts these principles to work. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the movie in the comments below. Did you catch this one, or did it fly under your radar? If you can find it, the short time commitment makes it an easy watch, even if you're not sure if it's your type of thing. Before we go, I'd like to give a huge thanks to my donors memorialized in the Hall of Headshots. I have a website set up where you can support the channel through donations or merch. Any donation unlocks a growing collection of uncensored movie recaps. And if you enjoyed the video, I would love for you to become a part of the channel by subscribing. Thanks for watching.